Welcome to NewsClick. The Parliament did, amongst all their squabbling in this session, manage to pass a few really important bills. Amongst them is an act that will replace our old Land Acquisition Act, which was passed in colonial times in 1894. To discuss the new bill, we have with us today Dr. Smita Gupta, an economist.
Hi.
Hi, Smita.
Hi.
Now, has there actually been a change in thinking regarding the process of land acquisition in this new bill? I mean, have changing conceptions of eminent domain, for example, been accounted for in this new bill?
There has been a change in the sense that what we had earlier was a colonial bill, where it was completely unmindful of people's rights. And now we have a completely neoliberal bill, which is tipped so heavily in favor of industry, in favor of urbanization, in favor of large infrastructure development, that once again you find that people's rights have been undermined in the name of giving them rights. Let's take, for example, the question of eminent domain. Much of the debate has wasted time on being either for or against eminent domain. But if you look at eminent domain in India, its historic evolution came from the land reforms legislation. When did we use it the first time after independence? It was to discipline zamindars, it was to redistribute land, and it was to protect the rights of the tillers. And now look where it has come. Through this entire process, eminent domain is being used to expropriate and dispossess the peasantry for industry and for large projects. So the whole question of eminent domain is not really whether eminent domain should be used or not, but should it be exercised in the interests of the poor, or should it be used to increase megabucks? And I think what we've done is, from using eminent domain in favor of a colonial overlord, we're using it today in the interest of big profits for big companies.
Do you believe that there should be a consent requirement even for government acquisition? The present draft, for instance, only requires consent in the case of private acquisition or acquisition for private purposes. Now, the bill, of course, permits the government to acquire land for private use or for PPP projects, and various people have said that the government shouldn't acquire land for private use. I mean, others have said that they do need to act as an intermediary in such a relationship where there's such obvious inequality in bargaining power. I mean, what is your opinion on this? And could you also comment on whether the bill accounts for changes in land use, for instance, post-acquisition and so on?
We have to go back a little bit as to what the 1894 Act was doing. What was it doing? You had two routes for land acquisition. One was land acquisition for the government and one was for private companies. So for government, it was through part 2 using eminent domain. The other was through part 7 for private companies, where you had to have a memorandum of understanding. Again, it had to be clearly for a public purpose. Why was the government playing a role? Ostensibly because, as you rightly said, the balance of power is pitted so much against the poor landowners that it was important for the state to intervene. So I personally feel that the government must always play a role when land is acquired either through eminent domain or using the Land Acquisition Act, or it is acquired by direct market purchases. Because that's what is happening today. If you look all around us, even in and around Delhi, what do you find? You find huge land purchases. And then after the land is bought, they're getting land use changes done. The whole case which involves Mr. Khemka's transfer, for example, in Haryana is one such example, where land was bought from farmers who had no idea why the land was being taken from them. And then land which was worth a couple of lakhs became worth crores overnight, simply because of a land use change. Now, why should the farmer be denied a share in the increased land value because of the land use change, simply because she or he didn't know that it's going to be changed? They had no idea. Therefore, the state has to play a very important role in the acquisition or the acquiring of land for the private sector, a role of a regulator, not just of a sort of forcible acquirer, but as a regulator, so that people get their full compensation through price plus their R&R rights. Those have to be protected. As far as consent is concerned, first of all, I think we should be very clear that this bill is a good example of, what should I call it, skullduggery of the worst kind, where you are saying you need consent. Ostensibly 70% in the case of PPP and 80% for private companies. But if you look at it, there are two paths of public purpose. When the government is acquiring for its own use, there is no bar on transferring it through SEZs or in corridors to private companies by lease. There's no bar. And in fact, in the definition of public purpose, where consent is not required, there the government can just merely acquire thousands and lakhs of acres and hand them over to companies in corridors, in SEZs. In any of these places, consent is not required.
So you do think that the definition of a public purpose is extremely broad, since the whole purpose of land acquisition is circumscribed by ensuring that the end result is public good. Do you feel that it is defined too broadly then?
In fact, there is no definition of public purpose because it says public purpose includes.
Okay.
So the moment you say includes,
It's not an exhaustive
it's just an
definition.
illustration.
Yeah.
So the moment you have an illustrative list, it is not restrictive. It doesn't even follow any principle. Why does it include all this? Why does it not include all this? And at the moment it includes everything under the sun. So there is no definition. And more importantly, who will determine public purpose? The courts have increasingly in the last few decades ruled that the government has absolute authority to decide what is public purpose. And this derives from the 1894 Act, the Colonial Act. This has not got changed today. We had expected it would be democratized. People will decide, is this public purpose or not, through various institutions, but that has not happened.
Okay, so how does the new legislation seek to address problems posed by the old Act, especially as far as adequate compensation and rehabilitation are concerned? Two issues that were at the height of a lot of protests over the last few years.
Yes. Yes, you know, there's a lot of hype which has been made out by the minister that we're going to give 4 times the land price as compensation. I think in compensation there are 2 issues. The first and most fundamental is who will receive the compensation. What is your definition of affected persons? And here again we had expected that everybody who has any dependence on the land will get compensation. That has not happened. They have included a whole list of people who are occupiers, but then added all kinds of overriding clauses like 3 years residence.
Right.
People may have lived there for 40 years, but how do they prove it?
Yeah.
So they have added all kinds of riders to occupancy, which means that finally it's only owners with legal titles who are going to get their rights. So it's a lot of words, but in fact what's going to end up happening, as you can see from the wording of the Act, that the affected persons are going to be very, very narrowly restricted.
Of course, the government's logic is that they want to prevent squatters from getting compensation.
No, they're not saying that. They are in fact not saying that. Because in many states, as you might know, tenants, encroachers and owners, all 3 have got R&R rights. You look at the Kerala policy, for example. In many states they've done it. The Narmada, the Narmada tribunal had awarded that. But here they're taking it away by adding the residence rights.
Right.
So that's one problem with compensation, that is who gets the compensation. The second part of it is what is your compensation. If today I'm tilling the land as a farmer and my land is worth say 1 lakh, but tomorrow that land is going to be home to a huge urbanized colony and the value is going to go up for an acre to 25 crores or something like that. Why should I only get 4 lakhs? Yeah, that is the 4 times the value today. Why don't I get a share in the enhanced value? So how do I share in the benefits which derive from the land that I had owned? That's the second issue about how do you determine the compensation. And the third issue is the question of employment. That when I get compensation and I lose my only source of livelihood or my main source of livelihood, then how am I going to sustain myself without getting either land for land or getting employment?
So what are the provisions in the Act for rehabilitation? I mean, for instance, does it provide employment opportunities to rehabilitated persons?
Not at all. It says to the extent possible. In some places it said skills may be given. It had a very important clause for irrigation projects where land was to be given. Even that has been diluted in the last 4 amendments pushed through by Jairam Ramesh right at the very 11th hour. So the whole question of employment and livelihood security is completely undermined in a bill which claims to give R&R as a right, as a legal right.
Essentially, you're saying they're completely vague and directory in nature, these provisions. Would that be
They
correct?
are not just vague and directory. They, in fact, they don't even make adequate provisions for it. Yeah. So it's not as if it says to the extent possible, because courts, as you know, have ruled on to the extent possible and have said, in fact, it may be mandatory.
Yeah. What special rights does the bill actually confer on SCs, STs, and other disadvantaged groups, which are, of course, I mean, who are losing vast amounts of land in this, push towards development, in particular in forested areas?
You see, as you know, the 5th schedule areas, the tribal areas, have got special protections. under the Panchayat Extension to Scheduled Areas Act and so on. So, till now, it was very clear that no forcible acquisition of land was possible in these areas. This act is opening up the possibility of forcible land acquisition in tribal areas, even though it claims this will not happen unless there is consent. But then consent from whom? So, it says consent from the Gram Sabha or any panchayat at the appropriate level. Now, what is the appropriate level? Could it be the Zilla Panchayat? You know, which panchayat will decide whether this particular plot of land should be acquired? That's one. The second thing which is very important is common property resources. As you know, for many communities who are dependent on natural resources, livelihood is far more dependent on common property as compared to private property. But this bill allows monetization of common property, and it says you can take away people's common property rights. So, the protections which were ensured even on forest land and under the Forest Rights Act, even those protections have been undermined by this act.
Now, industry is upset because they claim that the new act will, increase the cost of land acquisition and increase compensation, will raise property prices, so on and so forth. I mean, what are your comments on this?
I think industry has a great cause to celebrate, because this act in fact does nothing. You know, for example, you take social impact assessment. Industry had been crying itself hoarse on the social impact assessment provision.
Yeah.
And had it been there, it would have been great. But now you have a whole chapter which deals with constitution of the committee, tasks of the community, what the report must contain. And then you have a little clause which says the government need not accept it, provided it gives its reasons for not accepting the findings in writing. Therefore, it's not binding.
Yeah.
So, social impact assessment is not binding. What else can industry cry about? It's getting land which is agricultural land at the price of agricultural land, even though it's 4 times, but it's still 4 times the price of agricultural land. And it's converting it into industrial land or into urbanized land or into large infrastructure. So, it's reaping, it's earning this ground rent on this property, which is huge. They are crying about delays in procedures because they are huge procedures. But there's this convenient urgency clause.
Yep.
So, all that they need to do, they don't have to go for consent. All that they have to do is get the government to declare an area into a corridor or a special zone. All that is allowed without consent. So, government takes it over, the government has to own it, and then it gives it out on lease to these people.
That actually brings me neatly to my next question, which is something I find very surprising. Why does this new legislation exempt land acquisition proceedings under a whole lot of other legislations, including, for instance, your special economic zone and so on and so forth, from the provisions of the Act?
I think it's to keep acquisition cheap, because in this Act, the only thing which has actually happened is compensation has gone up from what it was. It hasn't gone up to what it should, but it has certainly gone up from what it was. And to keep it cheap, they have exempted a large number of acts from it. That's the main reason.
Okay, so that's all the time we have today. Do join us again for further issues that we discuss here on NewsClick. Thank you.